wrestling for the Army, and actually won my first world championship wrestling for the Army in the Armed Forces Wrestling Championship. It's called SISM, the Military World Championships in 1988. That summer in Palermo, Sicily, was a pretty amazing wrestling journey. And that basically was the start of my combative sports training and a life spent on a wrestling mat. Basically, it wasn't until '97 when I started fighting and got introduced to the sport of mixed martial arts, or no holds barred, as they called it back then.
Yeah.
Kind of did that on a whim. Was coaching at Oregon State, coaching wrestling, and saw this sport. And back then it was a little different. You filled out an application and sent it in. There was no amateur ranks. There was no proving grounds or place to get your feet wet. You just jumped right in. And my very first fight was UFC 13. I fought twice that night in a heavyweight tournament. And the ball was rolling, off and running. So.
And back then there was, how many rounds was it?
It wasn't rounds. It was a 21-minute fight. It was 15 minutes. And then if nobody won at the end of the 15 minutes, you went 2 3-minute overtimes to hopefully determine a winner. And then it was about a year later that we started running towards regulation. They started implementing rounds and coming up with unified rules, and all the things that we see in the sport now are all because of that, running towards regulation, trying to be understood as athletes and as a sport. Because for a long time there, most people thought we were crazy, that we were criminals because of what we do, because we get in the cage and fight. But obviously that's not the case.
It was brutal in the beginning. I remember when it first started. It was brutal.
Yeah, it was tough. It was a tough way to make a living any way you cut it. But back then, there were only 3 or 4 rules on the books, really. You couldn't groin strike. You couldn't eye gouge. You couldn't strike in the throat. And you couldn't fish hook. And some people don't know what a fish hook is. If somebody has a cut or you stick your finger in somebody's mouth, that's considered fish hooking. And that was outlawed back then. But that were really the only 4 books, four rules on the books at that time.
Wow. And so